The Joe Rogan Experience.
I think a lot of people listening to us years ago, it's just like, this sounds conspiratorial. And it's just like, what actually happened? And there's a couple like really important dates that happened that are historical that I think like set this structure really intentionally. The first was 1909, the Flexner Report. So literally John D. Rockefeller's personal lawyer wrote the report for Congress that basically set the standard that's the standard today for medical education. And it literally says in the binding guidelines that holistic health and nutrition and anything about interconnectedness of the body is pseudoscience. It says we need to name the condition and cut it out or prescribe it.
And what year is this?
1909.
So they're still going by the recommendations of 1909.
We still follow the Flexner report.
Some a policy. I mean, and we
so
could get
crazy.
the policies, but like rescinding the Flexner report and having updated scientific education and standard of care guidelines based on what we've learned since 1909 about the majesty of the interconnectedness of our body is a really good first start, because we're binded under a law, just demonstrably, just like, again, not conspiratorial. John D. Rockefeller's personal lawyer wrote this report. Why? Because John D. Rockefeller is the father of the pharmaceutical industry and created pharmaceuticals from byproducts of oil production, and was the first investor into Johns Hopkins and other major medical schools, University of Chicago, and started the modern education program for health. There were some big issues in the health. This was the Wild West, but he created Johns Hopkins and the standard of residency training as a way to silo diseases very intentionally and then prescribe his products and interventions as the top pharmaceutical maker. And the medical schools that he created were basically a distribution system to him. Okay, so you get to World War II. Up until World War II, around that time, the 1950s, 1960s, I would argue almost any medical miracle you can think of or any listener can think of was created before that time. You know, it's all acute situations, emergency surgical procedures, sanitation procedures, antibiotics to make an infection not deadly. Almost every medical miracle we can think of was something that was going to kill you right away, infectious disease. And then you take the pill or take the treatment for a finite period of time and you stop it, or do the surgery quickly and you're cured. Those are medical miracles. And we had a lot of good things happen up until World War II. Very intentionally, the medical industry saw the birth control pill in the late 1950s, 1960s. And the birth control pill was the first pill in world history that people took for longer than a couple weeks. It was the first pill ever that is like, oh, interesting. You can actually convince someone to take a pill for years, for almost most of their life. Recurring revenue. And there was a huge emphasis of the medical industry to take the trust engendered up until 1960. RFK talks about this. We didn't spend money on chronic disease management. All medicine was acute issues. Chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, that was outside the doctor's office. They saw that you could medicalize chronic conditions. Today, 90 to 95% of spending is on chronic conditions. So what do? In the 1970s, literally the Sackler family, their grandkids did the opioids. Their forebears created Valium. And 30% of women in the United States in the 1970s were on Valium. Time Magazine, Valium Nation, Mommy's Little Helper.
Yeah. So
we started creating all these psychiatric conditions. We started medicalizing heart disease. We started medicalizing all these type 2 diabetes, started creating academic research totally funded by the pharmaceutical industry, saying that type 2 diabetes isn't reversible, that it's basically genetic, heart disease, all these things, and started pilling them. Then what happened to food? Chronic disease wasn't that big of a deal in the 1970s, 1980s. You look at the graph of all chronic conditions, there's just a sharp turn in the 1980s. It's literally almost to the year of the Surgeon General report saying smoking wasn't great. So the second that report came out, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds were two of the largest companies in the world. It wasn't like Microsoft and Google on the top companies list. It was like cigarette companies. Dopamine is a really good thing to sell, which the tech companies do now. And they used their cash piles. And by 1990, the three largest M&A deals in American history, in world history, were cigarette companies buying food companies. So you had Nabisco bought by R.J. Reynolds, you had Kraft and U.S. Food and you see those graphs of all the food companies owned by like a couple companies. That was the cigarette companies. And they did two things very, very intentionally. They took over the institutions of trust to say ultra-processed food was healthy, and then they took their scientists and rigged the food itself to make it more addictive. Not to kill kids, but to make it more addictive. So you had that little food pyramid which said ultra-processed food is great, low fat, carbs, base of the pyramid. That was constructed literally by the cigarette industry to promote their addictive products. And this weaponization of food, as I call it, it's not just like this conspiracy. Literally the cigarette industry, those two companies, Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, were the two largest food producers in the United States. Like 50% of American food were created by cigarette companies in the 1990s. And they have gotten us addicted and weaponized this food, and all chronic conditions have just shot up. It's because that ultra-processed food, literally by tobacco industry scientists, hijacks our evolutionary biology. Again, you can't overeat grass-fed steak, but these food, with scientists much smarter than any of us, that's what they're doing. They're shutting off our satiety signals. The byproduct of this cheap addictive food, which we don't even have research for yet, is that it's sprayed with all these chemicals. It's sprayed with 10,000 chemicals that are allowed in the United States when only 400 are allowed in Europe. All these chemicals to make the food addictive, to make the food cheap, to do the monocropping. And that food is absolutely, and we don't need to wait for the research on this, these chemicals, these neurotoxins are destroying our cells, destroying our microbiome in ways we don't fully understand. So I just want to make clear to everyone, this has happened very intentionally. And it can be undone pretty quickly too, but we have to realize this isn't a conspiracy. It's true corruption that happened deliberately.
I would just add a few more dates. I think one thing about the research, we're one of the only countries in the world where the burden of proof for harm, we allow these chemicals to just enter our food system. We have 10,000 chemicals in our food system. Europe, only 400, because they have to show that it's safe before they use it. We're allowed to use it, and then only if there's issues that crop up do people have to do research. So, there's this ridiculous GRAS, generally recognized as safe designation, which is essentially a company self-assesses whether the chemical that they are creating is generally recognized as safe. No one's overseeing it. And Brigham talks about this, compassion for the FDA. They're overwhelmed. There's a lot of stuff to do. It's kind of like a hoarder's house. Where do we even start? I don't necessarily know if I buy that. I think that it's pretty bad and bought off that we have all these chemicals. But they basically just have to self-designate if it's generally recognized as safe, and then it can go into our food system. One thing that I find really interesting is that I really reflect on a lot is what is the difference between a food chemical and a drug? They're all just synthetic molecules that are made in factories, in labs by scientists. Do you know what the difference is? Intended use. So basically, if the intended use is for food, you can synthesize almost anything you want and put it in food. We are being mass drugged and poisoned in our food system with 10,000 virtually unregulated chemicals, which have bought off papers saying that they are safe. I mean, you look at what happened with all the Monsanto litigation about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They had to release this whole thing called the Monsanto papers. They were declassified, where they wrote scientific papers saying that glyphosate is safe. So there's all this corruption in there where basically we have 10,000 unregulated chemicals in our food system and we're getting sick as hell, obviously. And then you've got the evidence-based people saying, well, we need to have a 10-year longitudinal study to show that glyphosate is causing XYZ disease. And it's obviously that's not the right approach, because first of all, it is the synergistic combination of all the toxins that are now in our environment that are leading to all these pleiotropic health issues. That's very hard to study. So we have to get our heads out of our ass and use our common sense and realize what's going on, and not wait 10 years with these, NIH-funded studies that are going to be corrupted. And, I think, so that's just one thing about the food chemicals. I just wanted to add to your point, Cal, some other dates, you look at the processed food emergence. Processed food really didn't start taking off until these mergers. There was a little bit of a start of it. Ultra processed foods did not exist before World War II. We needed to have shelf stable food for soldiers and things like that we could ship, and so there were maybe some good intentions there. But then there was an opportunity there that got seen, and we can also weaponize the feminist movement against being in the kitchen, you're a slave. You don't, that your values outside the home, you need to climb the corporate ladder. Here, have this convenience food that we basically made for soldiers, and we're going to tell you that this is actually your liberation. So of course we got people not cooking. Families aren't eating together anymore. Kids are eating 67% of children's calories now are ultra processed foods. These means foods that come from a factory made by food scientists, not just processed, ultra processed, the highest form of processing, 67% of calories. Then you go to the 1970s and we have the advent of high fructose corn syrup, which, as Callie talks about, this preceded some of the mergers, but high fructose corn syrup is a weapon of mass destruction that basically food scientists used an understanding about hibernating animals like bears who fructose is one of the only types of calories where instead of making you feel satiated, it makes you more hungry. And this is evolutionarily, and we knew this. In the fall, when animals are preparing for hibernation and they start eating fructose-rich berries, they need to put on a ton of fat for winter. And so there's a feed-forward mechanism with fructose where it actually gets the bears to be hungry and even violent to outcompete other animals to get as many berries as possible in a short period of time to lay 3D print fat for winter. So you have the scientists understanding this and say, hey, we can make liquid fructose 1,000 times more potent than the fructose you'd find in berries. Same molecule, but in higher concentration. And we can add it to everything. We can add it to salad dressing. We're going to add it to ketchup. We're going to add it to children's school lunches. We're going to add it obviously to sodas, and we're going to make people insatiable. We're going to make their bodies and their brains think that they're preparing for winter that's never coming. It's really interesting. There's two amazing books on this. Richard Johnson from University of Colorado wrote Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and then David Perlmutter wrote Drop Acid. Both books are about a molecule called uric acid, which is unique to fructose metabolism. So when fructose is metabolized in the body, not like glucose, it creates uric acid, which creates oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain and the body, that if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, you're not going to be able to process sugars to energy, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. So you break the mitochondria with the excess fructose, overloading the mitochondria with uric acid. And then what happens? You can't turn sugars to energy. So what do? You turn sugars to fat. So you start 3D printing fat because you break the mitochondria with excess fructose. And on top of that, the mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress when happening in the brain is what may inspire the violence and the ADHD and all that stuff to make the bears manic so they get as much berries as possible. This is what's happening in every kid in every classroom in America now. And so that's kind of some of the biology very simply about what's happening. But this is the thing about fruit, is that we have 40 trillion cells and we have the ability to clear uric acid and we have the ability to process fructose in a physiologic amount. We're never going to have the uric acid increasing and overloading the mitochondria if we're eating an apple. It's when you're eating 20, 30 times the fructose that an apple has and you're literally pouring it down, that all of a sudden, imagine you get this huge rise in uric acid in the body and other things that are happening. And that's when it overwhelms. So it's a bit of that dose makes the poison, because our body has the ability to excrete toxins. Our body has the ability to deal with some heavy metals. Our body has the ability to probably clear some level of glyphosate, but we can't clear all of it all the time, 24 hours a day,